Welcome to The Debate. Today we're opening up Lawrence Kohlberg's really groundbreaking theory of moral development. It's a structural approach that traces how our moral justifications evolve from the very concrete to the very abstract.
It is a remarkable piece of work, yeah, and it really maps out that changing landscape of moral reasoning. I mean, when we look at the source material, you see how examples like the schoolyard fight, they illuminate that pre-conventional level, which is motivated purely by, avoiding punishment or personal gain, all the way up through the conventional level, which is much more focused on upholding societal norms and legal order.
Exactly. The structure gives us this clear progression, and it's one that culminates in stage 6. This is the level defined by an adherence to universal ethical principles, justice, compassion. It's famously exemplified by the headmaster's reasoning in the source material. And that is really where our discussion is going to focus today. I would argue that stage 6 is the necessary and logical culmination of this entire developmental arc. It's the required intellectual peak that makes the whole structure coherent.
And see, that's where I just don't quite see it that way. While stage 6 is, undoubtedly an ethical pinnacle, an ideal, I maintain that it's conceptually discontinuous with the 5 stages that come before it. To me, it represents a fundamental conceptual leap that kind of breaks the smooth trajectory of development that's built on consequences, relationships, and social structures. For me, it functions more as an ethical goalpost than a consistent developmental endpoint.
Well, my position is that the Kohlberg framework models a journey of increasing scope, complexity, and, crucially, increasing abstraction. So stage 6 isn't just some arbitrary final stop, it's the realization of moral autonomy. The source material emphasizes that at this stage, the right action is always an end in itself, and that requires a profound intellectual separation from any kind of transactional morality. To get to that level, you have to transcend the entire conventional framework.
But that transcendence is the problem, isn't it? If we look at stages 1 through 5, they're all fundamentally rooted in external things. Whether it's, avoiding a stick in stage 1, demanding a carrot in stage 2, meeting peer expectations in stage 3, or upholding codified law in stage 4. In all of them, the moral agent is defining right and wrong based on relationships or consequences. Stage 6 demands an allegiance to abstract, universal principles that are independent of all that. That isn't a developmental step, it feels like a cognitive pivot that abandons the previous mechanism entirely.
I see why you'd emphasize that pivot, but I would argue it's a necessary realization that's achieved through progression, not a sudden departure. I mean, consider the path. Stage 4 demands mastery of law and social rules. Then, stage 5, the social contract, introduces the complexity of questioning those rules, asking if they serve the greater good. It's only when the agent realizes that even the best social contract can fail specific individuals or infringe upon universal rights that the need for stage 6 principles arises. The headmaster's reasoning that rules are valid only if they are grounded in justice is the rational product of recognizing the limitations you find in stage 5.
Okay, but if it were the logical product, why does the source material explicitly say that the headmaster's adherence to these ideas operates at a complete disconnect with what society thinks or the rules say? I mean, a culmination should integrate and refine what came before. Complete disconnect suggests a rupture, an outlier that exists outside the predictable developmental curve. And plus, we know that Kohlberg himself, late in his career, had difficulty empirically finding subjects who consistently operated at stage 6. He often viewed it more as a theoretical necessity than an observable outcome. If so few people get there and it disconnects from society, maybe it's just an aspiration, not a stage.
The lack of widespread empirical evidence doesn't invalidate the theory's structural logic, though. The theory describes how moral reasoning is structured. The fact that the jump from stage 5, utility and contract, to stage 6, universal rights, is difficult, well, that just reflects the profound intellectual challenge of developing full moral autonomy. It requires moving from a mindset where you ask what works for us to asking what is inherently right, irrespective of utility.
That philosophical shift is the entire point of the post-conventional level.
I'm still not convinced that the three levels form a truly coherent structure. Let's focus on that chasm between the conventional and the post-conventional. The conventional level, so stages 3 and 4, is all about societal maintenance. You've got Betty conforming to gain approval, the teacher enforcing rules to preserve order. The core premise, as you said, is that the fairness of rules is seldom questioned.
That's true. It's a foundational level of societal stability.
Precisely. The entire moral calculus is based on accepting external authority, whether it's relational or legal. So to move from that state of acceptance to stage 6, where the commitment to justice carries with it an obligation to disobey unjust rules, requires a complete conceptual reversal. You're essentially moving from a system of moral maintenance to a system of radical moral critique, where your highest obligation is to break the system if it fails the universal test. That's a rejection of the conventional premise, not a development from it. The conventional level doesn't prepare you for disobedience. It prepares you for obedience.
But I think you're underestimating the role of Stage 5 as that necessary transition. Stage 5 is already inherently critical. It looks at the contract and says, look, we made this, so we can change it, and we have to test it for its utility to all members. The leap to stage 6 is just realizing that if utility conflicts with the intrinsic value of human life or justice, then utility has to fail. The conventional stages provide the language of rules and structure. The post-conventional stages provide the ethical measure against which those rules are judged. It's an intellectual expansion, and I think it proves the structural integrity of the hierarchy.
But the mechanism changes entirely, and that's what suggests discontinuity to me. In the conventional stages, the question is this action compliant or useful? The answer is pretty immediate and external. In stage 6, the question is, does this action align with abstract, self-chosen principles of justice? The answer is internal. It requires a complex intellectual calculation that's completely independent of external validation. It's a move from empirical morality to transcendental morality. To call that smooth is to overlook the cognitive rupture required.
Okay, let's delve deeper into that idea of the internal calculation. Let's look at the headmaster's justification itself. The material specifies that his stage 6 principle is defined by compassion, this belief that people should understand each other's viewpoints and not feel alone. You suggested this focus on feeling seems distinct from the reasoning of the previous 5 stages.
It absolutely does. Stages 1 through 5 are grounded in these cognitive or social frameworks: consequence, reciprocity, social approval, law. When Kohlberg introduces compassion as the driving universal principle, it injects an emotive quality that seems to undermine the rigorous cognitive progression he established earlier. I mean, why does the ultimate stage rest on a feeling rather than a similarly structural principle like, say, the categorical imperative or pure rights theory? It risks turning moral justification into an appeal to virtue instead of a continuation of developmental reasoning.
I think we have to be extremely precise with our terminology here. When the headmaster talks about compassion, he's not advocating for sentimentality or, raw emotion. He's advocating for a rational commitment to radical empathy and the equal consideration of every single viewpoint in a conflict, which is a foundational requirement of universal justice. Compassion in this context is the intellectual method through which the abstract principle of justice is applied to human conflict. The principle is justice. Compassion is the evidence of its execution. It's a cognitive tool for moving beyond self-interest.
But if we accept that stage 6 hinges on self-chosen universal principles, how do we distinguish between a purely subjective, strongly held belief and a true developmental achievement? The principles are universal, yes, but they're also chosen by the individual. So when the underlying motivation becomes defined by an internal value like compassion, it pushes the stage closer to subjective personal philosophy than to a predictable, objective cognitive endpoint that logically follows stage 5.
That's a fair challenge about subjectivity, but the key is that these principles, whether centered on compassion or rights, they have to be rationally defensible, logically comprehensive, and universally applicable. They can't be situational or self-serving, and that immediately differentiates them from the lower stages. That commitment to a principle that forces you to acknowledge the needs of a stranger over your own societal group, that is the very definition of moving beyond conventional constraints. Let's go back to stage 5 and focus on Jessie's reasoning about the fight, because I think she is the clearest intellectual bridge here. She understands rules as a social contract, but she really struggles with whether that contract should be immediately applied. She weighs the rule against fighting with the idea that Tom deserves to finally learn his lesson for having punched a younger girl. That intellectual complication, that moment she weighs the societal rule against individual equity, is the immediate necessary precursor to stage 6. She's asking the first principled question: does this rule truly serve justice in this unique case?
That's a very strong rating of Stage 5, but I think it highlights the critical difference, not the seamless link. Stage 5 asks, does this rule effectively fulfill the social contract? It's a question of social utility and agreement. If the rule fails, the contract should be renegotiated. But the moral authority is still the contract itself. Stage 6 asks, regardless of the contract or social utility, what does abstract justice demand? The moral authority shifts from the collective agreement down here to the universal principle up there. Stage 5 is functionally rooted in rules and consequences. Stage 6 is fundamentally rule independent.
But morality is rarely a sudden leap. It's a recognition of inadequacy. The moment Jessie recognizes the inadequacy of the social contract to handle specific injustices, the failure of the agreed-upon system to deliver fairness, is precisely the moment she begins the cognitive search for a higher, more reliable standard. That standard must be stage 6. That recognition is the developmental engine.
And that recognition of inadequacy is exactly what suggests a conceptual discontinuity to me. If the previous step were adequate, the next step wouldn't require abandoning its core mechanism.
We can't really discuss this framework without talking about the Heinz dilemma, which Kohlberg designed specifically to force reasoning away from stages 2 and 4. The questions he uses, like, would it change anything if Heinz didn't love his wife? Or what if the person dying was a stranger? Are strategic tools. They dismantle the emotional and relational anchors of the conventional levels, forcing the respondent toward the abstraction required to reach the post-conventional peak. The framework itself implicitly validates the existence of the highest stages, because without them, these dilemmas can't be resolved on a purely principled basis.
I agree, it forces a moment of reflection, but look at the outcomes. If you're reasoning at stage 4, the answer is clear. The law must be upheld, theft is wrong, period. If you're at stage 2, the answer is also clear. Save your wife because she's your partner, but don't steal for a stranger. Stages 1 through 5, even though they conflict with each other, they always give you clear, action-based answers rooted in consequences, relationships, or social structure. Stage 6 is the outlier because it's the only stage that allows for that definitive commitment to a principle, life over property, that completely overrides all the constraints established by the 5 stages before it. The law becomes irrelevant, personal relationships become irrelevant, social consequences become irrelevant. The fact that stage 6 provides this transcendent moral justification independent of all these factors, it just reinforces my claim that it's an ethical ideal that's distinct from the consistent developmental path of the lower stages. It's not the final step on the ladder, it's an entirely separate structure built on different philosophical assumptions.
I disagree fundamentally with the idea that the structure is separate. That overriding commitment is the very destination that the moral agent is striving for. The post-conventional agent stops accepting external authority, be it legal, social, or transactional, and realizes that the only true authority is the universal, abstract principle of justice. That principled moral calculus is exactly what the previous 5 stages were struggling to define and implement, imperfectly. It doesn't break the structure. It completes the moral circuit by achieving genuine ethical independence.
But independence that's achieved by overriding the entire prior structure, that still looks like a disconnect, not a seamless continuity. If I have to throw away the rule book I spent 5 stages learning how to create and use, the final step isn't development, it's revolution.
Development often necessitates a revolution in thinking.
Perhaps.
But the key distinction remains the mechanism. Stage 5 reasoning is focused on the utility of a social system for a community. Stage 6 reasoning is focused on the inherent dignity and rights of the individual, which trumps any system. That shift from a collectivist moral utility calculation to an absolute individual rights calculus is just too significant to simply be called the next step.
And yet, Kohlberg framed it as a 6-step staircase for a reason. He saw stage 6 as the ultimate achievement of human moral rationality, demonstrating that moral action can be fully divorced from pragmatic necessity and aligned with pure philosophical ideals.
He certainly established it as the ideal, yes, but whether it functions as a developmentally guaranteed or structurally continuous endpoint, that remains highly questionable, based on the internal evidence of the model itself.
So, to summarize my argument, stage 6, characterized by universal principles and a deep commitment to justice, must be seen as the logical and necessary developmental peak. The entire structural trajectory requires an endpoint that moves beyond purely self-interested, relational, or rule-based morality and reaches a level where moral action is intrinsically right. This progression represents the full achievement of moral rationality.
And on the other hand, the textual evidence of the complete disconnect, coupled with the unique, principled nature of stage 6 justifications, which include the obligation to disobey unjust rules and rely on abstract concepts like compassion, suggest a different conclusion. Stage 6 operates outside the cognitive constraints established by the conventional levels, making it function more as an ethical ideal or a theoretical endpoint rather than a continuous observable stage in the human development sequence.
Well, we've certainly rigorously explored the structural integrity of Kohlberg's final stage.
Indeed, and Kohlberg's framework, regardless of where we draw the boundaries of continuity, provides a crucial and enduring lens for understanding the complexity of moral justification in action. It forces us to confront not just what we do, but, why we justify it.
Thank you for engaging in the debate.